We're highly honored to have here today the three Sea Service chiefs. Admiral John Greener USN is a submariner who's commanded at all levels in the Navy, ship, squadron, group, and fleet. He has extensive experience in the Pacific Fleet, multiple tours, including 2 in Japan, the last of which was as commander of the 7th Fleet. He also served as commander in Guam and deputy commander of the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Most recently, before this assignment, he served first as commander of Fleet Forces Command in Norfolk, then as vice chief of naval operations, before becoming the 30th chief of naval operations in September 2011. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Pete.
General Amos, Commandant of the Marine Corps, has commanded at all levels in the Marine Corps, from Lieutenant Colonel to Lieutenant General. A naval aviator and a fighter pilot, he served 4 flying tours, flying the F-4 Phantom II, and later commanded Marine Fighter Tech Squadron 312, deploying in that tour in the squadron as part of CVW-8 on Theodore Roosevelt. As commanding general of the 3rd MAW, Marine Aircraft Wing, he commanded Marine Aviation Forces in Iraq on the march to Baghdad. He's also commanded 2 Marine Expeditionary Force and the Marine Corps Combat Development Command. He became the 35th Commandant of the Marine Corps in October 2010. Sir, welcome.
Thanks, Pete.
Admiral Papp. Admiral Bob Papp, U.S. Coast Guard, is a career cutterman who has served in 6 cutters, commanding 4 of them, including America's tall ship, the Bark Eagle. He's commanded at all levels in the Coast Guard, and his most recent operational assignment was as Commander Coast Guard Atlantic, where he commanded the operational forces of the Coast Guard in the eastern half of the world. His experience spans the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and the Great Lakes areas of operation. He became the 24th Commandant of the Coast Guard in May 2010 and leads the largest component in the Department of Homeland Security. Welcome, Admiral.
Thanks, Pete.
Well, it's been just about 1 year since the defense strategy rolled out, and the strategy emphasized the increasing importance, the enduring importance of the Asia-Pacific theater to the United States. Several people have called it a pivot. The document clearly uses the term rebalance, but all of this implies that somehow we left the Pacific. A key predicate was the fact that the U.S. would be able to push forces over time into theater, and particularly Southwest Asia would diminish as the 2 land wars wound down. Now it appears that certain people, the Iranians, the Syrians, the Yemenis, did not get the memo. And not only do we have the tension for existing forces, absent near-term congressional action, the services face the 1-2 punch of a CR and the potential for sequestration cuts that could concentrate on you in the next few months. So let's get into our questions, and I'll ask the CNO the first question. CNO, what are the Navy's priorities in executing the strategy, and can you give us an idea of the Navy's progress fulfilling the strategy, especially the rebalance?
Sure. Thank you, Pete. First, I want to thank Jim and Bob for joining us out here today. And I think it's important that everybody understand where the Sea Service is here. Our strategy is a collective strategy, our maritime strategy, that is, and Jim and Bob and I and our staffs are working on exactly that as we revise and think about our future and our maritime strategy. So again, it will be of the Sea Services. And secondly, I'd say we are all a member of the Joint Chiefs. Bob joins us for all of those meetings, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, the meetings where we make these kind of decisions and we talk about the strategy. And I tell you, it's important to understand this has been a very collaborative effort and will be in the future as we take on the challenges. But to your question, Pete, as I look into the future, my priorities and the ones I put out when I took over as a chief remain. Warfighting has to be first. We have to endeavor to operating forward, and we got to be ready for what we need to do today and in the future. That will guide us in the strategy, and that will guide us in the challenges ahead. But what we've done, we've looked at the Defense Strategic Guidance. I think we're doing fine. The 10 mission areas that are laid out there, our budget as laid out there on the Hill, the 13 budget is fine with that regard. And I think we're making good progress. Now, how we rebalance, how is that measured? A lot of people, when it's Navy, it's like ships. There's much more to it than ships, but that's what people like to see. So can I have the first graphic? I just want to put a graphic up that lays it out perhaps more clearly. As you look at this graphic, look in the lower right and you see these are the number of ships we have today and how many we'll have as we go through the decade. Today, when we've deployed out there, of the 288 ships, we have 103. Half of them are in the Asia Pacific, and you can see up there in the centerpiece. 52. About 42 of those 52 are non-rotational. That means they are there in Japan, in Singapore, in Guam. They are either where we home port, where we forward station, or where we deploy and then rotate the crews. And the point of this is, of the 52, we get great leverage of those that we can keep out there and operate forward. And there's a similar perspective of that as you go through the other areas of the world. But my point here would be, as we go forward, as we rebalance, you can see we'll go from 52 to 60 ships out there. Well, how do we do that? Well, there are a host of ways. I mentioned one. We move ships forward. The second would be we bring ships in, such as the Joint High-Speed Vessel, such as the Littoral Combat Ship, the Mobile Landing Platform, which is built here in San Diego, and a float forward staging base, which is also built here in San Diego. As these ships come out and occupy their place out and around the other geographic combat commands, that will free us up to focus our effort in the Western Pacific and continue that. So it's about ships, it's about other forces as well. Our first deployment of the Joint Strike Fighter at the end of this decade will be in the Western Pacific. We'll deploy the P-8, which is the replacement for the P-3, in the Western Pacific here later this year, excuse me. We will put the BAMS, Broad Area Maritime Surveillance, which is the Marinized Global Hawk, in Guam in about 4 years. So our forces, air and surface, and our ships and air, will rebalance, if you will, by priority in the Western Pacific. So it's about forces. It's about also home porting. We will migrate to having 60% of our ships in home ports by the end of this decade in the West, if you will, west of the Mississippi. It's about capability. We benchmark our capability in our budget to the Western Pacific, from electronic attack, counter-cruise missile, counter-ballistic missile, ASW, cyber. I think you get my point. We use the Western Pacific as our benchmark. That doesn't mean we don't balance that capability around the world. To your point earlier, others may not have gotten that same. The world gets a vote, maybe put another way. But capability-wise, it is benchmarked on the Western Pacific. And lastly, partnership and intellectual capacity. We have rebalanced that toward the Western Pacific, toward the Asia Pacific, I should say. And what that means is it's not only nurturing relationships already there with the Japanese, with the Koreans, with the Australians, with the Singapore government, but it's looking for new opportunities with the Philippine government, Vietnam, Cambodia, and other areas. It's bringing China into RIMPAC. It's all of that and shifting our study, our intellectual capacity toward the Western Pacific and Asia Pacific. We're doing it at the War College. We're doing it at the Naval Postgraduate School. We're doing it in our exercises, as I mentioned, as we expand RIMPAC and others. Lastly, I'd say one more time, we can't do it without a partnership here among the services. And I draw your attention as you look at that shift to Northern Australia there in Darwin. A very important aspect is the invitation by the Australian government to rotationally deploy Marines to Australia and that whole southeast area. And what's key to that is building up the Marine force, and the Commandant may or may not discuss it, but building that up in the rotation force. But for us in the Navy, it's having the lift that matches and resonates with that. And we're working together with our Marine Corps brothers and sisters to do that. And we will have that capability to do that second ARG, second Amphibious Ready Group, patrol, or if you will, rotate, deploy to the Western Pacific and meet that requirement. So it's all of that coming together. I'm satisfied we're on track. The tenets apply. Our focus will be, regardless of the CR and the sequestration, to meeting this concept. The numbers may change, the concept's the same. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Continuing with the defense strategy, and the last thing you mentioned was ARG. I'd like to go to the Commandant now and just say, present this question. In 2013, facing the continued fiscal crisis, the possibility of sequestration, and a year-long continuing resolution, how committed is the Marine Corps to the strategy and its design for force laydown in the region?
Yeah, Pete, thank you. I remain very strident on. In fact, I wrote a letter to the chairman and copies to my fellow service chiefs before Christmas, talking about. I think we need to stay the course with the strategy. The strategy was developed, a year and a half ago, published by the president almost a year ago now, and it was a good one. Several of us were involved in developing that strategy. It was done for the right reasons. It met the emerging world, and it positioned forces and levels of effort where I still believe they should be. And I think the Asia Pacific is a great example. It was marketed just a little bit, probably off base, only in that people drew the conclusion that meant we were going to starve the rest of the world of U.S. military influence and effort. And that was never the case. Folks from the Africa Command were worried about it. Folks from Europe, folks from Southern Command down in South America were concerned about it. And that was never the case. That was never the intent of the strategy. The strategy was okay, where are you going to put your principal effort, understanding that, as you said, the world gets a vote. We've seen that now in the last year. We started with the Arab Spring and went to the summer and went to the fall. Now we've got the whole Arab year. Now we're into the next year and all the things that are happening. So there's a piece of this that for all of us, and the service chiefs understand this and deal with it, is that we may like to think that we're done with those thorny other things that are going on around the world, but they may not be done with us. And so that is why we are paying attention to other areas besides the Asia Pacific. But back to your question. I'm absolutely committed to kind of removing or moving Marine forces back into the Pacific. We never left. We've had about 15,000 Marines in the Pacific for the last, all the way through OIF-1 and the wars in Afghanistan. Secretary Gates came in and he said, I want, and reaffirmed by Secretary Panetta, I want 22,000 Marines west of the international date line. We're going to realign forces in the Pacific in accordance with the agreement between Japan and the United States government. That's a good agreement. It was agreed to about a year ago, 2+2. We're in the process of laying all that out. We've got some environmental impact efforts underway. But that will sort itself out over the next couple of years, and I feel very good about that. So when it's all said and done, we are committed. In fact, we've got a little over $3 billion in the FIDP right now to realign those Marine forces into the Pacific. Some of that money is going to Guam, some of it's going to Australia, some of it's going in other areas. But we'll eventually end up with, the reasonable amount of Marines on Guam, a pretty good sized bunch of Marines up in Iwakuni. We'll have Marines on Okinawa, and we'll have some Marines down in Australia. And then hopefully we'll be able to operate, just as John said, with the extra ARG down in the Pacific, and actually be able to do the things that naval forces can really bring to the table in the Pacific. So I'm very strong on it. It's the right strategy. I support it. I don't think we ought to fall off on it. We're going to have some challenging times ahead. How do you afford? How do you cut Solomon's baby? But we'll work our way through that.
Got it. Thanks, sir. Next, the Commandant, the Coast Guard. Sir, we've heard the discussion about the DoD rebalancing to the Pacific, and I wanted to get your perspective on how you see the Coast Guard's piece of this action, and do you see the necessity for a similar shift of strategic or operational focus? And if so, where would you articulate the Coast Guard's role in that?
Well, thanks, Pete, for the question. And let me just take a quick moment to thank AFCEA and the Naval Institute for inviting me out here. It's an extra special treat to not only be here, but also to be with these two officers who I respect greatly. Obviously, we get to spend a lot of time in Washington together. We very seldom get time on the road together, so this makes it very special. Besides working together, I think we enjoy each other's company and our spouses, and we've got a very collegial group. And I also thank General Dempsey and before him Admiral Mullen for including me in that group. As most people know, I'm not a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but they treat me as if I'm one, ask for my vote. So consequently, I've been involved and observing and watching the National Defense Strategy development over the last year and a half or so. Now, admittedly, right up front, the Coast Guard does not play a large piece in the defense strategy, and I think rightly so. We have niche capabilities that we can provide to the other services. We're happy to do that. It's part of our direction and the statutes that govern us. But we all know that it's not a large part, but it's specialties like patrol boats or marine inspectors and other things that we can be called upon to provide from time to time. What I would ask you to do is look at something that the Coast Guard is responsible for, which I have termed Maritime Governance. And Maritime Governance is a collection of responsibilities that we have, just as national defense is part of the grander national security strategy. There are other components to that. For instance, economic security, energy security, environmental security, the security within our ports, homeland security. And all those collectively come together. And while we may not have a large part in the defense strategy, we have a large, enduring, everyday part in all those other things, most notably homeland security. But economic security, now this is a maritime nation. 95% of our trade comes by sea. If I could have the first graphic, please. 95% of it comes by sea. And I would ask you to think beyond the traditional Mahanian concepts of freedom of the sea, sea control, power projection, and think more in the terms of maritime governance, those things that have to go on every day to keep that prosperity flowing, that trade that comes across the ocean. As you look towards the Pacific, you see those long lines coming across the Pacific are our economic prosperity, the trade that comes to our shores. The entrances of our ports do not start in places like San Diego or LA Long Beach. They start in places like Singapore, where hundreds and thousands of containers are loaded and come to our shores. We have Coast Guard inspectors over there that assure security procedures are in place before those ships are loaded to come to our ports, where we don't want to be dealing with a security crisis in the red zone, as I call it, in the end zone. We'd prefer to push that out overseas. But when you look at this chart as well, those blue areas that are lined in surrounding Alaska, the continental United States, the Hawaiian Islands, and all our trust territories out there, that's the exclusive economic zone. That's the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which is about 4.5 million square miles. Now, by comparison, China has about 350,000 square miles. We have 4.5 million square miles of exclusive economic zone. And all those activities, whether it relates to energy, the environment, the economy, counterterrorism, and all those other missions that the Coast Guard has, aids to navigation to make sure that mariners approach our shores safely. All that falls within that context of maritime governance. So we understand fully the importance of the Pacific, and it's those sort of maritime governance things that have drawn us out here. Our first cutter arrived in California in 1849. Why? Because of commerce, the gold rush, the increase in human activity, American activity on the West Coast. We brought the first representatives of the U.S. government to the territory of Alaska in 1867 when we received it from Russia, and we've been up in the Bering Sea and the Arctic ever since. We've recognized the importance and the demands of the Pacific by, over the years, moving 10 out of our 12 high-endurance cutters out to the West Coast because of the long distances, the need for substantial ships that can withstand the distances and the time and the weather that's produced out here. And all of that has been for those enduring missions that the Coast Guard does, with a side benefit of being able to help out our defense partners as well. So the mission space is expanding. Most of our trade now comes across the Pacific. We have fisheries stocks to be concerned about and all those other things that the Coast Guard does. The Pacific is a big part of the business that we do, and I think we have rebalanced over the years. I don't see us increasing any of our resources out here. What I'm fearful of is that those 12 high-endurance cutters that I talked about earlier are being replaced by 8 national security cutters. And regardless of how substantial and technically advanced those 8 ships are, they can't be in all the same places that 12 have been for the last 45 years. And so relating it back to the challenges with the budget, I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to continue with the construction of those cutters and then get into our offshore patrol cutter as well, because we need those ships to be able to carry out our duties. And quite frankly, Secretary Napolitano has been giving some great support, great continuing support to help us get those ships built.
Sir, just a follow-up question. With the capabilities that you described on the Coast Guard side, there's a lot of talk on the DoD side about partnership. It strikes me that in many ways you match up better with a lot of people in the Pacific littoral. Could you talk a little bit about the Coast Guard's contribution to the partnership piece?
I sure can, and I wish we could do more of it. The statutes that I'm governed by don't allow me to spend Coast Guard appropriations on engagement overseas. That generally we can provide people and ships and expertise, but it needs to be paid for by the Department of Defense or the Department of State. So we get involved whenever we can and when we get the support. And also, by the way, if we're out doing high seas drift net or Navy exercises like carrot ops and things like that, we try to provide our ships so that we can relate. If you look at the South China Sea right now, at a certain dispute that's happening out there, what you will see is lines of ships from China and Japan. They're painted white, and they have diagonal colored stripes on them. One side says Japan Coast Guard. The other side says China Maritime Surveillance Agency. And quite frankly, there's a great article that came out recently. China has 5 separate agencies. They call them the 5 Dragons. All of them are involved in various aspects of maritime governance. The title of the story was A Need for a Unified Coast Guard, and in the article it says we need to make ourselves look more like the United States Coast Guard, because those are the type of forces we need on a day-to-day basis for maritime law enforcement and governance missions.
Got it. Just an editorial note. As I understand it, the China Maritime Surveillance Service is really almost singly focused on exerting claims. They're not near as a force for good, if you will, that the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard model is.
They have Coast Guard, a fisheries service, a customs service, maritime surveillance, and there's one other that escapes my mind now, but if you collect the 5 of them together, they have almost as much of the mission space that we do.
Got it. Thank you. Just shifting back to C&O for a minute. Sir, one of the big inflection points seems to be moving away from the counterinsurgency environment and into what Cold Warriors might think of as a pretty comfortable environment, deterrence, forward presence. But I just wanted to ask, how is the Navy refocusing and addressing the demands of non-permissive, high-end combat? How are you preparing the Navy back for the future?
Well, the concept of air-sea battle kind of guides our effort. And as opposed to saying just anti-access aerial denial, it's assured access, because it's leveraging our advantages in the undersea domain, our advantages in the fact that we have expeditionary warfare, unique skills, amphibious warfare skills, cyber skills, global reach, all of that. And it's also looking across the other services and coordinating our efforts. The way to do it is to look at the culture of how our officers and our planners think about this, because you got to open your aperture right off the bat. You got to put that in your operational plans. You got to exercise it. You got to write it in doctrine, and you got to program for it. A lot of folks talk about, like, first, okay, well, we're going to program for it. I'm telling you, Pete, it won't matter if we buy the stuff, but we don't know how to use it in a assured access approach. We got to think across the domain, and what I mean by that is An aircraft up there can do a lot of things clearly in the air domain and maybe on the surface domain, but you got to understand the effect it can bring in the undersea domain. We talk about cyber. If cyber can put down an effect that is keeping us from getting in somewhere, an aircraft site, you name it, we ought to use it, and it should be part of our planning. So it's bringing all of that into the whole concept of how we think about the challenges. Some folks say, well, okay, so you're talking about the China campaign. And I tell you, if we only thought about that, we will fail in other areas because we won't be using all of the skills, all of our advantages to our effect. I'll go back to just briefly the Fukushima nuclear plant incident. We were precluded. We had an anti-access environment of radiation and contamination. And we had to think of some clever ways just to get in and measure the radiation levels and do the things we wanted to do so that we could bring in comfort, bring a different effect in, that would be aid or comfort. So in the end, that guides our effort, air-sea battle. But it doesn't only guide our POMs and our budget. It also guides in how we collectively across the services think about assuring access.
So, just to follow up with you mentioned if you just focused on China, you'd miss part of the picture. But if I could just ask about China for a moment, it's clear that the PLAN is modernizing. They're increasing their force size. They're ranging beyond their normal operations areas and becoming a little bit more assertive out there. Is there anything in what they're doing that's causing us to have to make a change at the moment?
Yes, in a way that we are making the change, but we're making it by conscious effort. And a lot of that has to do with operations inside the first island chain. Clearly, we talk about maritime interactions as a strategic area. As we look across the interagency approach to, what is worth where we operate? How does it impact our overall posture in the Western Pacific and in the world and with a country that we trade with? So some call it lawfare, some call it, many different areas. But it becomes not just could we win in a conflict? The question is, do we want to risk that? What is it worth diplomatic-wise and overall? So it has caused us to operate differently, but again, it's by conscious. There are some domains we haven't changed anything. The undersea domain, we own it. We go wherever we want right now today, and it's our job to assure that that is the case. But in some domains, we've operated somewhat differently. But that's, again, by our choice. We have the option to approach it differently if we choose to.
Thank you. Commandant, you've spoken many times on the relationship the Marine Corps has in the Asia Pacific, and that your force really came of age in the Pacific in World War II. Can you speak on the Marine Corps' current partnerships in the region and how those will further the U.S.'s growing relationship in the coming years?
You bet. I'd be happy to, Pete. Our nation has 5 major treaties in the Asia-Pacific area. It starts up north with Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, and Australia, New Zealand. Those treaties have been in existence for, and some of them over 60 years. And our partnership now with, for instance, the Australians has never been stronger. So there's a good example. We've been on the battlefield both in Iraq, and we stand on the battlefield shoulder to shoulder with them today in Afghanistan. So the partnership with the Darwin deployment that John had referred to earlier is actually just kind of a natural progression of a relationship that's been built for really all the way back to World War II, when the Marines were in New Zealand and then started working their way up through Australia and up the Marshall Islands. So there's a great example of a partnership. We have been in and out of the Philippines for many, many years. We still have a treaty with the Philippines, the United States has, a mutual defense treaty. Most people are unaware of that today because we left the Philippines many years ago, as you're aware. But today we operate, we train, we have Marines that are training alongside of the Philippine Marine Corps. So that relationship is building. We've got a very strong relationship with Singapore and Thailand with their forces, and of course Japan as well as South Korea. So those relationships are critically important in that part of the world. Not only is it the largest combatant commanders area in the world, but it's certainly covered by water more than any of the other theaters are. But there are some other things that are significant there. First of all, it's got one of the major choke points that come up through the Straits of Malacca. 100% of Japan's oil and China's oil comes through the Straits of Malacca. 49% of the world's commerce travels through choke points all around the world. A big chunk of what comes in, you saw Admiral Papp's slide where you saw all that commerce coming to the United States. We've got 70,000 people a year are killed by natural disasters in the Asia-Pacific area. And that's incredible. So we need to be there to not only do presence missions and not only be able to influence good behavior, which is what you were kind of alluding to with regards to China, but also to help our partners out. And to do that, quite honestly, you have to have developed relationships. Trust has to come out of those relationships so that they know that when things happen, that the United States, whether it be the Fukushima nuclear reactors, the follow-on as a result of that terrible earthquake and tsunami, or whether it be the recent horrendous typhoon that settled over the top of the Philippines in the December timeframe. We were there to help, and that's what we do, and that we have great interest in that part of the world. And lastly, I don't have a map, but if you recall when John put his map up, and both Bob, and you saw where Australia is. If you took a look at where Australia is, and imagine that being in the center of your map, not the United States, where this is the way we view the world right now, just exactly the way this slide is. But from Australia's perspective, and I was there and they showed me a map, and Australia's right in the middle of it. And yet you take a look at Australia, and all of a sudden you see their view of the Asia-Pacific area, and it's different than ours. And you can see why they're very interested in the relationships they have, the very strong mutual relationships they have with us, and why it's actually very important for us to work alongside the Australians in bilateral and trilateral and multilateral engagements, because they actually know those countries down in the Southwest Pacific area very well. They've got relationships. The last thing I'd say is Australia is an exporter to China. They send more into China than China sends into Australia. So you talk about relationships, value of all that, why we're there, the Asia-Pacific region, and you start thinking about why it's so critically important for us to be out and engage. And the last thing I'd say is that I don't think anybody can do it quite as effectively. I mean, I'm a little bit parochial, but I don't think anybody can do it as effectively as naval forces can. And I say that because we step lightly on our friends and neighbors. We don't have to come in and build a big base. We don't have to have massive landing rights. We don't have to put large footprints. We actually can operate from the sea, from a sea base, from using naval forces, and be able to build those relationships and that trust in the region. So I think we're the force of choice,
Sir.
so to speak.
Agree. Admiral Papp, you touched on the Arctic briefly, but just blind flash of the obvious, in this half of the world, the way to the Arctic is through the northern Pacific and through the Bering Strait, 44 miles across at the narrowest point. And one area that, I'd like to ask you to expound on is that area up there, and is this something that you think we should be spending more effort on? Is this an area that you think we should be looking at harder? And what is the Coast Guard's role specifically with respect to the Bering Strait and north?
Sure. If I could go back to that first graphic that I had, just for a little context, if you look down there in the Eastern Pacific, from South America and in the Caribbean, those red lines coming off of South America represent about 800 metric tons of drugs that try to make their way to the United States. Most of them go into Central America and then in Mexico, and we know what sort of violence and disruption that is occurring down there. There's still about 400 metric tons that gets into the United States because there's a market for it, and we'd like to be able to interdict more of that in the transit zone before it gets into Central America. As you look at all the blue areas and the pink areas that are down there in the Western Pacific, prime fishery grounds, migratory species, et cetera, those are our trust territories down there. The blue is the exclusive economic zone, and all those pink areas that you see represent potential extended outer continental shelf claims if we ever accede to the Law of the Sea Convention. Now, if I could have my second graphic, and build that, please. Oh, maybe we got the wrong one. Darn, you know, I had one for the, this was especially for the CNO, because I always look at his graphic, and he's got, I don't know if you noticed it on his graphic, there's a little orange symbol for valve thing that he uses on all the choke points. And I keep teasing him all the time that he never gets all the choke points because we've got that 44-mile gap there between Russia and the United States called the Bering Strait. Ah, there it is. That was just for you, John.
He does valves too, yeah.
So think about this. This is my rebalancing in the Pacific, because all those things I talked about, energy security, environmental security, economic security, and homeland security come into play in an area which now has an ocean that's expanding. There's more exclusive economic zone that's ice-free now, particularly during the summer times. Those are Coast Guard equities to make sure we cover those missions. Last summer, those two red dots, the one off Barrow, which one in the Chukchi Sea and the other's in the Beaufort Sea, those were the two drilling sites for Shell Oil. And they brought up there last summer 22 ships, 2 drilling platforms, and on an average every week there was about 650 people out there. So that's 2 oil drilling platforms, 22 ships, and 650 people that weren't out there a year ago, that weren't out there over the last 100 years. But now we've got intense human activity, helicopters shuttling crews out there, potential for search and rescue, potential for environmental damage, security concerns. We know that Sea Shepherd and other groups would like to disrupt operations like this, and we have some of the most environmentally sensitive areas in the United States that affect fisheries, whaling, and other things, and indigenous people that deserve to have their rights preserved as well. So that's brand new mission space for the Coast Guard. And we don't have any additional assets to be able to go up there. And what would come in most handy, particularly when you look down at the south there in the Aleutians at Kodiak Island, that's our nearest air station. It's Kodiak. It's 860 miles from Kodiak all the way up to Point Barrow. Oh, some really treacherous terrain. In fact, if we send a helicopter up for a search and rescue case, we have to send a C-130 ahead with a fresh crew, so by the time the helicopter gets up there, we can replace crews and do the mission. So with no organic facilities on the land, we did exactly what General Amos suggests. We send naval-type forces, the Coast Guard. Last summer, to cover all those duties, we sent the National Security Cutter Berthoff up there. Berthoff, quite frankly, has better command and control capabilities on board than any shoreside Coast Guard station in the world. It carries 3 boats and trained boarding teams. It has hangars for 2 helicopters, so we can provide the helicopter service, boats for rescues, security, communications, and, oh, by the way, it can sit on station for 60 days without resupply. So that's what you do with naval-type forces. You can take on extra mission space where you don't have organic shoreside capabilities. And quite frankly, I'm not convinced that the United States, at this point in our time and our economy, should start investing in shoreside facilities until we have a few more years of operating up there. And in the interim, we use those forces that leave a small footprint that go up there and operate. But it's a new challenge for us. Once again, our our forces aren't increasing. I just told you we're replacing 12 Hamilton-class cutters with 8 national security cutters, and we've got more places to be in. So what that causes us to do, back to my opening, is we have to take forces off drug interdiction. We have to take forces off fisheries patrols. We have to take forces out of Navy exercises where we could be sharing our experience and helping to build partnerships across the Pacific. So that's where we pay the price. Those are the lost opportunities for no growth and for increasing mission space.
Thanks, sir. This one's for the Commandant. A follow-up question. You know, anymore, Commandant, you meet a Marine and you have to ask them, have you done a MEF deployment, or I should say a MU deployment afloat? It's getting to where maybe half the people you ask that question to, they say no. And I wanted to ask you, how is the Marine Corps preparing for the future, returning to its amphibious and expeditionary routes after the 2 major land wars have dominated your focus in the last decade?
Yeah. Even though we've been predominantly on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan for the last 11, 12 years, we've still had 7 Marine Expeditionary Units, 2 of them out almost persistently. One in the Western Pacific that is 4 deployed naval forces. So that's in and out of port and in and out of operating in the Asia-Pacific area. So there's one, and then we've always got one that's deployed on the East Coast, off the East Coast. And then when that one's coming out, the West Coast has one out. The 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit is on Peleliu, as the command ship is out in the Gulf of Aden as we sit here today. So we haven't lost that skill, and I get asked that often. Well, have you lost your ability, those skill sets? And the answer is no. But the truth of the matter is we have fewer Marines that have deployed on naval vessels than probably at any time in our history. So back to where we're headed, and I think the answer to your question is that we are, in fact, I was just briefed on an exercise here this morning. Not only did we do a major bulled alligator off the East Coast a year ago, I mean major exercise under the command of Fleet Forces Command and 2 MEF. But we're also doing one out here. We started one that just concluded today, Dawn Blitz, and then they're actually going to do the live one here this June. And that is a major amphibious naval Marine Corps exercise, putting Marines back on ships, command and controlling, operating off the ships, doing the types of mission sets that naval forces historically have done and will continue to do in the future. So there is a renewed effort on part of both our services to get us back to that teamwork. Again, we never left it, but now it's time to go back to those kind of what I call our bread and butter, or blocking and tackling skill sets. People talk an awful lot about, well, you'll never do another forcible entry and operations. So why would you ever need to practice that, or why would you even need to think about having equipment that could do that? And the truth of the matter is that it's a skill set and a very small piece of our national defense and our naval force to be able to do something like that and to be able to impose America's will should it ever have to do that again. And my sense is that it would be pretty naive to think in the future, whether it be a decade, 2 decades, 4 decades from now, that there won't come a time and place where there'll be the occasion, and it may not make sense today, but it will make complete sense when the occasion occurs, when our nation has to say, it's time to impose our will, and we need a force to be able to come ashore in a hostile area that's not welcoming that force. So all those skill sets are things we're getting back to. So, and the last thing I'd say is that I try to brag as often as I can, not only in the relationship that the 3 of us have, and Bob Papp actually had it right. I mean, we truly are very close friends. But the relationship that John Greenert and I have between Commandant and CNO, I'll just tell you, I haven't seen in a long, long time. There's little that I do that I don't talk to John Greenert about. In fact, to show you how this works, I had actually said I'm not going to come to AFCEA here in San Diego. And John Greenert called me and says, hey, Jim, why don't you join me and Bob Papp on the panel? And I said, well, if the CNO wants me to come, I'm going to go. So that's the relationship. So you owe it to him. But my point is that as we look in the future, we start talking about another ARG down in the Pacific. We start talking about our ships' capabilities, command and control suites. We're doing that as a team right now, and it's never been better. I'm very, very optimistic, very bullish on it, and I think we're going to be back. We'll find Marines 5 years from now, Pete, that you're going to walk up and say, "What was the last ship you were on?" I go, "Oh, I was on Boxer just last summer."
Just to follow up, you mentioned at the end that command and control part,
Right.
And because of the nature of our Naval Institute AFCEA audience with the strong communications piece, can you tell us, as you refocus back afloat, maybe for industry, what some of your challenges are? I have this mental picture of this huge fiber optic pipe going into a FOB in Helmand or Kandahar, and now Marines going back to sea, and how's that going?
I think there's a couple of things. Futuristic, and we've got the Deputy Commander of Cyber Command sitting down there, Dog Davis. We're dealing right now with the concept of kind of the cloud following us around above ships and being able to reach up and pull data down, and being able to have the data-centric capability, not so much equipment and network-centric capabilities. So we're working on that because the fact of the matter is that wherever we go in the world, both the Navy and the Marine Corps have got to be able to reach into this cloud and pull this data down. So that's out in the future. We're working on it. It's something that the service chiefs talk about. In fact, last week we were talking about it at a tank. But back to the now and the equipment. When I was a MEF commander down at the Camp Lejeune, all my MU commanders would come in and they'd say, "Sir, we're going back out to sea, and once again, we've got the wrong command and control suite. The Navy's got everything they want, and they haven't given us anything." And so they'd say, "Sir, you got to help us." So this is before Amos and Greenert era, okay? And so I'd try to figure out how the hell we're going to solve this problem. Am I going to have to cough up money? And so it was always a battle. We're at a point now where the common architecture between both our services and even as importantly our allies is really, really important today. So we were just talking, I guess it was late last week or early this week, John and I were, about our ships, command and control suites aboard, compatibility with NATO or other allies. How do we do this? How do we share information? How do we share classified information? We haven't solved that yet, but I tell you what, we're determined that these next generations of ships, these next generations of deployments will have that kind of capability with it. So I don't have all the answers, Pete. I just know it's a significant issue, and obviously this audience is involved in it. But we're going to have to solve it because we're going to have naval forces presence. We're going to have to be able to talk and operate not only as a joint force, but with our allies.
Thanks, sir. Yesterday, and this question I'd really like to give each of you a swing at this pitch. Yesterday, Deputy Secretary Ash Carter said, and he was talking about the sequestration and the CR, he said, quote, "I used to be hopeful and optimistic, and now I'm hopeful." And I wanted to ask you, especially with the respect to the short game and the long game, where does the rubber meet the road? How do you see this thing playing out? And what keeps you up at night about how this could play out for your respective services? It strikes me that last year, very political environment with the election coming up, it was difficult to have a really honest conversation about this. And then there was the hopeful part that just got X'd off yesterday about after the election we'd see some significant progress. But clearly it hasn't played out exactly per the plan. So I just wanted to ask each of you, for the near term and the long term, what are the potential dangers here? What keeps you up at night, Admiral Greener?
Well, there's two items here, and they're related, but they're distinctly different in the way they manifest themselves. Continuing resolutions we've had almost every year, 4 years. Right. You know, and I don't mean for F-O-U-R, I mean for a lot of years. And we've dealt with it because we've known eventually we'll get a bill. And it's been a kind of an agitator, if you will, or a distractor, but we knew eventually we'd get there. So we put off starting programs because a continuing resolution takes the previous year's money, puts you into this new year, says no new starts, and that's across the board, manpower, everything, and your last year's spending level. But again, it was eventually going to come about. Usually in the last number of years, a supplemental came with it, which would help overcome any inefficiencies due to lack of contracting. This year, we're talking about the entire year. So you go no new starts for the whole year. So every new thing has to be not done, or they have what's called an anomaly. You have to individually go up and get permission for each new project. So tedious, what do we miss? That bothers me a lot because we miss that opportunity. Two, well, this year we have more requirements than we had the previous year, yet we're looking at the previous year's spending. We expected a bill. We all collectively expected a bill. You knew that. And we might still get a bill. We're optimistic. The point here is we've got seven months left in the year. 5 months are gone, and we spent as if we were going to get the money. So now the amount of time is less. We got to go get that money if we don't have the rights, get the right project started up. Like in my world, carrier overhauls, multi-year procurement of destroyers, things of that nature. There's a small piece of good news. The manpower accounts are covered because we have a National Defense Authorization Act, and the funding from last year's manpower equates to the need for the funding of this year. So the message to the sailors, your pay is good, it won't affect you. So what's the problem? Well, we'll have to go where the money is and make up that difference that I said, and we have to make it up in 7 months. And you got to go wherever the money is that isn't already obligated. And that tends to be ship maintenance, operations, ashore maintenance and operations. And those are debilitating in the years further. So you don't know when it's going to come to roost. So that's a problem unto itself. The dollar values are extraordinary. It's about $4.5 billion for the CR alone. That's about 10% of the operating account that we have to make up.
For the Navy.
For the Navy, yeah. Add on to that sequestration. So $4.5 billion, and then the operating account alone, that's an extra $4 billion. So that's 8.5. That's 20% of our operating account in 7 months, with less than with just over half the year that we have to reconcile. So what do? How do we reconcile this? Well, a bill would be nice, and if we can't get a spending bill, then the authority to be able to rebalance across our appropriations, to take investment accounts and apply that money to the operating account where it really matters, so that we don't actually skip ship maintenance. To me, it's amphib ships, it's carriers, and then cruisers and destroyers, and the remainder of the ships were my priority because the amphibious ships really need the maintenance, and they're very, very busy. You can't just discard the impact on the shore infrastructure and those operations. They'll come to roost. So it's the ability to reprogram that. So what keeps me up awake at night is I don't know what I don't know that we will be able to get done in time. So we really need a bill, or we need authorities and direction on how we accommodate this problem for the remainder of the year. And the longer we don't have that, the more complicated it gets, obviously, as everything starts stacking up toward the end of the year.
Just a quick follow-on before we go to the Commandant of the Marine Corps is, it is a lot of money because it's concentrated, as you say, in the half year. But isn't there also kind of an insidious thing about this where people are saying, well, it's not a ton of money if you took a whole year, and yeah, we'll get through this year, we'll figure out a way. But isn't that just an ever-widening cut as you go year on year? I mean, if you start with another $500+ billion lopped off of I know for DOD, in addition to the money that was taken last year for the Budget Control Act, the 487, whatever it was, and the efficiencies the year before that, isn't the insidious thing about this that it's, you know, where does it end? Does that keep you up at night?
It does. If you take, as you were saying, 2 years ago, the number was $170 billion, 100 in efficiencies and another 70, which was put on top in the very end. So that's $170 billion out of DOD, and that was over, I think it was 10 years still. Then you add the Budget Control Act, that was 487 over 10 years. You put on top of that $500 billion, and the 487 was B's. Everything's B's today. M's are out.
Yeah.
Everything's billions. So where do we go? Where does it end? So to your point, as I mentioned, if we don't get the money, the ability to reprogram the money and get that done and keep the ops right, then we will have ships not maintained. They didn't get the maintenance done. Non-deployed readiness, steaming and flying will be not what it needs to be, and we will either not deploy ships, not deploy them on the time that they need to be deployed, or deploy them on the time they need to be deployed, but much less ready. That'll be a next year problem. Oh, but wait, there's more. There's next year, which is the $500 billion you mentioned. So we'll have to apply our attention to the operations account to get it right, because we've got to be ready, and warfighting is first. So that will mean a balance of force structure will be smaller, and a balance of the future Navy. And if I worry about one thing in all of this, it's the industrial base, the shipbuilding industrial base, particularly nuclear, because I don't know how many, well, I'll tell you, half of all the nuclear vendors out there are single source, meaning somebody's, you know, Bob's valve shop or something is the only one making some of this stuff. And if they go under because we just kind of take a holiday on some of that, I don't know that we get them back. And there's unfortunate anecdotes on losing that kind of skill, any kind of skill. So how we ever recover from that, I'm not sure, once somebody goes under, or how that will manifest itself. I just don't know. And that's what keeps me up at night. I haven't walked my way through the industrial base challenge.
Thank you, sir. General Amos, how do you see this? I mean, there's obviously the near-term piece, but there's potentially this long-term piece, and how do you see it playing out for the Corps? You don't know, as the CNO said, there's a lot of things we don't know, but what are your biggest concerns as we move forward here?
I want to take just a minute to put things in perspective here for everybody in the audience, because many of you are the recipient of defense dollars and contracts. There's no surprise to anybody. We're the smallest service, and we ramped up to 202,000. We're on our way down to 182,000, and we're somewhere right around 195 today, 195, 196. Our piece of the defense budget is actually very small, and I want to give you a sense, because if you were doing the math while CNO was kind of throwing the numbers out, we did the efficiencies, and we did this under the Secretary Gates era. Right. So that was already about $200 billion. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it was okay, find this, and then the Budget Control Act hit us for $487 billion. So now we're sitting at just right under $750 billion as we begin this. My budget that we submitted for FY12, now, this was obviously 2 years ago, for 12, was $23.9 billion. That's it. And we counted on OCO to supply the amount of money to pay for the Marines deploying back and forth to Afghanistan. We had 20,000 Marines in Afghanistan at that point. The training, those that are going, those that are coming, and a small slice of that was to help reset the equipment. In other words, when we bring equipment out, to reset it. But so that total, everything, OCO and all that, was right around $30 billion. So we've just added up a bill of $750 billion, and yet the entire budget for the United States Marine Corps was $30 billion. So it's this compared to that. So I take personally any efforts that start mucking around with budgets, and I really get very sensitive, because even a proportional cut has a disproportionate effect on us because our budgets are so small. All right. Now, so you ask, what's happened this year? As we've gone into 13 now, because we're under continuing resolution and we have to use an FY12 budget, my FY12 budget that when we were building it, we were told to put money in the baseline and take it out of OCO, and we did that. And by the time the budget was finally delivered back to us, it had been reversed, where baseline had come down and more OCO had gone in for 12. And yet that's the budget we're using right now for continuing resolution. So I've lost about 7 or 8% of the budget that I had before. I lost it because of the way the monies were moved around in 12. So I go into this year in a declining resource environment. So you say, okay, what are you worried about? Well, I tell you, we have taken readiness to be our main. First of all, the forces in Afghanistan are the #1 priority. They're going to get 100% of everything they need: people, equipment, training. We'll mortgage everything for the forces that are in Afghanistan. I will not leave them wanting a single thing. So that's #1. #2, because we are really America's insurance policy. I mean, we are a crisis response force. That's what we do for a living. We don't have a domain. We have a lane, and that's what we do. And so when things are bad, people look around and they go, okay, who can get there overnight? And they typically say, well, okay, where are the Marines? Let's send in the Marines. So we have to be ready. So to be that insurance policy, that hedge force for uncertainty, I've been pushing money now out of things like facility sustainment and other accounts into my O&M account so that I can maintain a high state of readiness for the forces that are deployable and likely to deploy. So we're going to continue to do that this year. So the truth of the matter is, those forces deploying and those forces that need to be ready for the rest of this year, you won't see a dip in readiness. But that mortgage is being paid by home station readiness, home station equipment, equipment that's not going into depots, equipment that we're not buying to reset. When Chairman Murtha was alive, he understood the problem of resetting equipment coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I remember General Corelli and I sitting with him over and over again, because he was the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee for Defense. He understood that we're going to have to pay money to reset that equipment. So you ask me what's keeping me up at night. #1, we're mortgaging, we're paying for future readiness, because that's what we do in the Marine Corps. We have to be ready with some of that stuff that we would otherwise either be able to recapitalize or sustain back home, #1. And #2, my sense is there is a growing lack of appreciation for really what has to happen to reset the equipment coming out of this war. We've gone inside the Marine Corps and said, I've asked all my 3 stars and 2 stars and said, okay, we've got to figure out what's good enough. In other words, what can we live with for the next several years? And we can run through the depots and go through a refurbishment and just live without recapitalizing. So, but there is, my sense, a lack of appreciation for just the sheer magnitude of the cost. It's a little over $3 billion. If the clock stopped today and we put all the equipment in Afghanistan on ships and sent it back to Blanc Island and through the depots, it's about $3.2 billion. And folks are going, you know, I don't quite have an appreciation for that anymore. And yet that's a bill, that's the Corps, that's our future readiness. That's the future readiness of the Marine Corps. And I'm very concerned about that, and that's what keeps me awake at night.
Well, thank you. I think that piece about the contingency money, I've often used the analogy that the contingency money was a bit of a two-edged sword, because it said, we'll give you all this money. It'd be like if you owned a car, and they said, well, you can drive it a lot more, and we'll give you the gas. And on a good day, if we're feeling good about it, if we're feeling large, we'll throw in the oil and the change, the tires. But in the end, you're going to need a new car a lot faster. And I think that recap piece, which was really never really allowed in the wartime costs There were exceptions for combat replacements and a few things here or there like MRAPs, but largely no recap. And I think that's underappreciated.
Yeah.
Admiral Papp, you've been sitting here patiently waiting, and you're probably thinking, these are some big numbers. But how does this look over on the DHS side?
Well, that's why I had to start off by challenging my shipmate here on the claim of smallest service.
Yeah, but you're a commandant. Don't ever forget that.
I mean,
That in and of itself carries a lot of weight.
It's good to be commandant.
I mean, we do have a B after our budget number, but we're still in the single digits. You know, the entire budget for the Coast Guard is about $8 billion. And in fact, the budget for the entire Department of Homeland Security is only about $40 billion. It's a very small part of the domestic discretionary side of the budget, which is only about half of the total budget for this country, with the defense having the other half. You know, I've been asked for years, people have come up to me, particularly during my time as Commandant, and say, wouldn't you be better off if you were in the Defense Department? And this is 1 year where I can honestly say no. We find ourselves in a little bit different situation because we're not subject to the defense cuts that have been going on that the CNO and the Commandant have been talking about here. So in that regard, we're lucky. The continuing resolution has presented us with a little bit of a problem, but not as much because it's based on the FY12 budget, which was pretty good for us. The second thing was, if the President's 13 budget had been enacted, that would have made it a little bit more difficult for us. But both chambers of the Congress gave us marks that were above the President's proposed budget. So even if the 13 budget is passed, we'll continue to be in pretty good shape. Of course, the sequestration issue, all bets are off. Certainly we have contingency plans for that. We're not even sure exactly how that will hit us because of where we're at within the department, but we'll be prepared for it if it happens. The thing that, actually I do sleep pretty good at night, to be truthful, but the thing that does concern me is exactly what the CNO was talking about. This having us consumed with the annual budget cycle really hinders what I see as one of the most important jobs of either Commandant or the CNO, and that's to look out to the future and say, what is this country going to need from our Navy, from our Marine Corps, from our Coast Guard 10, 20, 30, and 40 years from now? When you're building ships, you're talking about 30 or 40 years out, and what is the country going to need? And so being consumed in worrying about this annual cycle really prevents us from devoting time to what I think is one of our most important jobs, is to plan out that with some consistency and predictability for industry. I mean, I feel really bad. I feel bad for myself at times, but I feel really bad for industry because they're having to make predictions and judgments about how much of a workforce to hire, how many long lead parts do we order now when it would cost less money, but they can't predict whether that next ship will be in the budget or not. And so consequently, we end up being inefficient both on the government side and on the industry side. It ends up costing our taxpayers more, and it really hurts us in terms of making sure that we've got the right asset mix for the future.
A common theme you hear is the uncertainty in and of itself is inefficient at a time when we have no money to waste, and you hear that a lot. Well, if I could shift gears for just a minute, I'd like to get off the budget. We're done. But we had a good panel included in the conference on innovation. And history tells us that some of our best innovation occurs in times when you don't have everything you want, or maybe everything you need. And so I was going to ask each of you maybe just to touch on how are you approaching this within your services, because some people would probably cynically say that innovation in a big military hierarchical bureaucracy is maybe the impossible dream. But how are you approaching innovation at this time of austerity and encouraging that within your respective services? CNO.
Well, I have an executive panel. These are smart people in business. Some have had previous government experience to look at innovation. How does industry do this? And they came back and told me a few things. First of all, you got to set somebody outside of your headquarters to do it. Two, don't give them a lot of money or they'll put together an overhead, and that grows and breeds bureaucracy, and they'll cost you a lot of money. And number three, give them control of the budget. So for us, the Navy Warfare Development Command is our authority, if you will. In other words, they can reach out where they want, but they also have a budget. They've given them money, about $25 million, which some say that's plenty, and I'll give them more if they want, and say, go innovate. Show me what you got out there. Working with Office of Naval Research and DARPA, that Terry Craft is doing that right now. So that's where I've put it in there. He is scouring the fleet to say what sort of, not specifically, but what are your big gaps? What do you got out there? Where would you need help? And it could be an effect. It could be a power source. It could be a sensor, whatever, just something that's totally missing. So anyway, that's out of the headquarters, small enough budget, no overhead, take it within yourself, access and independence.
Got it. Thank you. Commandant.
We've got
Amos.
we've got kind of an official channel and an unofficial channel, and the official one is similar to what CNO talked about. We've got the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab established by General Krulak in the 90s, and their job was to actually wasn't so much at the time to go out and pull out new technology and bring that in, and maybe some type of robotic mule to carry that wasn't it was actually designed to be innovative thought on how we should be able to operate. Things that came out of that was operating on a distributed battlefield. Instead of set piece type forces maneuvering around in company size levels or battalion size or whatever, or very tightly focused force, they actually separated the force by, in some cases, 50, 60, 70 miles, which doesn't sound a lot unless you're on the force and you're a fairly small force and you have to defend yourself. And you have to be able to communicate, you have to have situational awareness, you have to have on-the-move communication. So all this began out of the Warfighting Lab, and it was an experimentation called Sea Dragon, and it's just evolved. So we have the Warfighting Lab today that still does that, but they also prod around in O&R. They've got relationships with DARPA, and so they actually are out there doing some of the equipment technology stuff, whether it be fuel, whether it be energy. And I mentioned the Robotic Dog. There actually is an LSSS, I think it's called, and it is a robotic dog. And I mean, it looks like about the size of a gigantic German Shepherd, and St. Bernard, and it can carry 300 or 400 pounds of stuff. And we're working on this thing right now. So can you imagine Marines being able to take some of their stuff off and put it on one of these robots and have it walk smartly behind them? So anyway, that's another thing. So that's the formal piece. The informal piece are actually the young Marines that are out there in the fleet. And I say this because, not tongue-in-cheek, because when we started talking about rebalancing the Pacific, pivot, whatever you want to call it, the fact of the matter is there's not right now enough ships to move the Marines around down there. It's just a fact of life, and CNO and I have talked about it. We're going to get there. So what do we do in the meantime? Do we say, well, we can't do this. We'll just wait till it's a perfect situation. And actually, it's the innovativeness of the young captains, the lieutenant colonels, the gunnery sergeants. And I said, okay, figure out how we're going to move in the Pacific. How are we going to get around? How are we going to train? You're going to use some commercial vessels. We're going to use some black bottoms. We're going to move Marines around on joint high-speed vessels. How are we going to do this so we can actually execute this strategy sooner rather than later? And then the efforts of Admiral Greenert and his plans to move another ARG in there will give us the capability to move around the Pacific on official kind of gray bottom naval vessels. But I tell you, there's a lot of other ways we can do business. And so that's the innovativeness that we have, that we're taxed to do this. And I agree. I think when you start running out of money, you start looking for other ways that you can accomplish the mission. And that's the informal chain, which are the young men and women that wear my cloth that are actually going to go out and figure it out.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Papp, I'm guessing that this is a case where small is good, and that's an advantage for you. But I'd like to hear your take on the innovation challenge.
Well, I think this is one of the things that I've been most discouraged about during my time as Commandant. Because what we've done is we've tried over the years to create a culture of innovation, starting at the grassroots level. And there are a lot of great folks out there that have come up with some very unique mechanical, electrical, or just design projects that have helped us out do things smarter and less expensively. That became more formal over the years. We had an Innovation Expo that was held at the Coast Guard Academy probably about 12 years ago now, and it developed into our Coast Guard Innovation Expo, which ended up being one of the largest NDIA associated events. We did that up until last year. But between the combination of scrutiny on conventions and such, attendance at them, the fact that with the budget reducing, a lot of people who will be exhibitors, and also just it was a large chunk of our budget that we had to devote to sponsor that as well. We had to cancel it this past year for all those reasons. I'm hopeful that we might get back into an every other year cycle, because what we did was we brought together a lot of young innovators from the Coast Guard, actually paid for exhibits for them to put on their displays, mixed in amongst all the industry exhibitors that were out there. And that way we got an interchange. We scheduled our fall Flag Officers Conference for that expo each year. Got our senior leaders out there, not to only see our young people, but also to see the industry folks. And that mix, I think, helped that culture of innovation. So it's one of the things I'm disappointed about. We're going to try and find another way of doing it. The other way is, a great example I think we've got right now is through our acquisition enterprise. Our next big project is the Offshore Patrol Cutter. We're going to replace approximately 30 of our medium endurance cutters that have been around close to 40 or more years with a new class of cutters. We're going to replace about 30 with 25. And the requests for proposal all just came in last week. And I also attended Surface Navy Association last week and got to see some of the people that are submitting proposals. And what we did was we set some objective characteristics. We also limited it by threshold. And then we said the driving feature on this is price. It's got to be affordable. And I'm really excited about this project. I'm excited about some of the obviously I can't look at those proposals, but plenty of people were offering sort of previews, and in fact there was one model that was at Surface Navy Association, and they're some pretty smart people out there putting their minds within industry, talking to Coast Guard people, and coming up with some unique solutions to the challenges that we find there at sea.
Well, thank you. I'm now on the other end of what I've been delivering over the last couple of days, because Ken Snyder's given us the sign that it's time. But before he comes up and thanks you, I just want to thank you for being here, taking the time to answer so many questions that were submitted by our audience, and thank you for leading the Sea Services at such an important time. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thanks, Pete.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Good job, buddy.